Hello, everybody, and good evening. I'd like to welcome today to our lovely speaker, Jessica. And as with the other talks, we are generously sponsored by Kat at ETC and Sean for your support at 3LR Lighting as well. Thank you very much. I'm going to let Jessica introduce herself because she knows herself better than I do. And I'm really excited to have her talking because she's one of our new lockdown friends to the IALD family, so a big welcome. As with the past recordings, just to let you know, they will go up on the IALD YouTube channel. Please remain muted if you're not speaking. If you want to ask questions, you can do so in the chat box, and if we have time, we'll get through to those questions at the end. And a big welcome tonight also to Beatrice, who's the IALD regional coordinator for us in the UK. So I think I'll be quiet and let Jessica continue. Welcome, Jess.
Hi everyone. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's such a pleasure. So my name is Jessica Young and I'm a lighting designer prominently in theatre lighting, but also kind of delve into installation, events and fashion every so often. But today I'm mainly focusing on storytelling in lighting design in theatre, and its correlation also to architectural lighting and how they do integrate and they do have crossovers between each other. And I guess lighting has become such an integral part to everyday life. It's all around us, you know, whether that's our screens, so our devices, our phones, the sunlight, reading lamps, x-rays, you know, it comes in, it's an element that us humans have learned to kind of control to our advantages over time. And it's really interesting that, you know, light also influences us and our behavior a lot more than we realize. It influences our emotions, the way that we hold ourselves. You know, it can really calm us, it can alert us, it can focus us in so many different ways. So it's a really powerful tool. And I guess using all of them elements, you can use that in order to storytell to an audience for a narrative. So I guess I kind of want to start all the way from the beginning of kind of, I guess, where light comes from, which I know we all kind of know, but it starts off, I guess, from the sun. So I've got this beautiful image from NASA Space Flight Center. And I guess, yeah, obviously this is the origin of where light comes from, and it illuminates us, it surrounds us all the time, every day. And I guess it's really interesting how we as humans have then taken that really natural light and then started to make it more artificial, so then we can control it more and use it more to our advantages and whatever we kind of need it for everyday life. And I guess the very first time that it was used in theatrical lighting, the sun was actually used in Greek amphitheatres, where when they used to tell stories and have theatre performances, they used to use mirrors to actually reflect the light from the sun in order to create rays onto the stage. And then they used to take an intermission in between, you know, the sun high up in the air to set in, and then they used to take an intermission depending on where they needed the sun to then be in the sky in order to use the reflection from that onto the stage. So that's really interesting how it kind of all started, and that's where it was first used in a very theatrical sense. And I guess modern day, there's a modern day use and example of the use of mirror reflections. So for example, Haberdashery, which is a London-based design studio, came up with this this idea of also bringing the idea of using a reflective parabolic mirror to take the sunlight and then reflect it down into urban spaces, down the side of buildings, in order to bring the sun a lot closer to us and to bring nature a little bit more direct into our lives when we're living in the hustle and bustle of a city. So that's a really interesting way also of how, you know, that's been used in quite a modern sense now. And also that idea of having a reflector also is used in a lot of modern day theatrical theatre lights, such as Fresnels, profiles, etc. So that's really interesting on how that's kind of evolved and how we're using that now. So what can light communicate? When it comes to storytelling in theatre, it's us trying to understand a story and to tell a story to an audience. It's so powerful and versatile. It can have a never-ending amount of possible uses through colour, texture, space, form, and intensity. We can use all of these qualities of light in order to help communicate a narrative to an audience. So the ways that light can communicate is it can communicate the time of day on stage, for example. So this is an example of a show that I did called The Human Voice, which is at the Gate Theatre. And as you can see, there was audience on both sides. So as you can see, audience here, but there was also audience on this side looking through this window. And the whole show, you could only hear her side of the story. So she was on the telephone, and you could only hear her side of the conversation. And all the audience members had headphones on. And the whole idea of it is that it starts from the afternoon at around 5 p.m. and it goes through the whole of the evening, right through into the early hours of the morning. So I had to really collaborate with the set designer in order to help, you know, kind of what textures she had on the walls, also where the set was sitting within the space. Also, we had to talk about the different practicals that we then wanted to use in the space. So when it did get to night time and it did get really, really dark in the space, we kind of wanted the actor to then go around the space to then switch on, like you can see fairy lights in the background and in the previous image, practical lights. And this was like hyper-realism. It was like a very naturalistic, super naturalistic set. So we really had to communicate that through the time of day. And as the character starts to put the lights on, there was also recessed lights in the ceiling. So that started to also indicate that we were going into the nighttime. So it was really interesting trying to communicate that time of day to the audience, who also were looking through windows, which were also reflective. So that glass was quite reflective. So it really also depending on where I put angles of light within that space in order not to obstruct how the audience saw the image through the glass. This was another image from a show that I did called Forgotten. And this is also indicating the time of day. So I used, as Tad described in the last talk about using side light, I used quite a bit of side light and also a high side light for this in order to create the sunset. So these two characters are walking through a cornfield at the moment and the sun is setting. So there's a really real importance about the angle of light and where that's coming from. And that's what evokes the feeling of where the shadows are hitting. And that evoked the whole feeling of the sunset within that space. And these are kind of images that inspired me or inspires me whenever I am working on a show where it needs you to be very specific on the time of days. So I tend to just, you can take images of the space that you're around, a street that you walk down every day that you don't necessarily notice the way that the natural sunlight is hitting the architecture of a building, for example. You tend to kind of, within a city, it's all hustle and bustle, and you kind of got to get from A to B. You've got to get home, or you've got to get to work, or got to get to drinks. But sometimes when you slow down, you can kind of take in your environment and see the beauty of how the natural light really reacts with different materials, with with different environments, and it's really brilliant. And so I started taking a lot of photos on my phones of, you know, these images, and this image on the left hand side was someone's living room window that I saw in Plymouth when I was actually on the way to tech in the show Forgotten. And I just saw that, and I just thought it was so beautiful, the way that you know, that light really reacts with the net curtains, and the way that they're swagged, and the way that they drape, and you know, the reflection, the shadows on the top from that. And that just really evoked a sense of, like, you know, there's real darkness around that, and you know, it's the nighttime, but then there's a real coziness that kind of brings you in. So that, you know, that tells a real story of that space. And then here was actually taken in my old flat, where the sunlight was streaming through the windows, and it was creating these beautiful shadows. And again, also, this is from a museum that I saw in Madrid. And just, you know, the windows that filled with the sunlight that came through, in the shadows, and the long walkway, and it just focused your eyes down the hallways. You know, all of these kind of images that you see in your everyday life also tells a story of that space as it is. And I just find that so fascinating, and always kind of keep a collection of that in my phone. But then also on the opposite side of telling, you know, like communicating the time of day, it can also take away the time within a space. So this is from a show called Blindness, and essentially, you know, the audience was sitting in these chairs, in these pods, with headphones on, being told the narrative through the headphones, but then visually around them in the space, we had these LED tubes that flickered and kind of accentuated certain moments in the story. And I think what was really powerful about that is also that it took away the time of day. So because you were in a black box, and it just didn't give you any sense of space or awareness or of time. So you had no. I think the show was about an hour long, and the audience, as an audience member, like, you almost felt like you weren't too sure whether you'd been in there for an hour or for 3 hours or for 5 hours, because you just got so immersed within that story. So that's another way that, you know, you play with the time of day as a lighting designer. You really mold how that can be communicated. You can really control it. You can either make it really speed up, or you can make it really slow down within a space. Another thing that you can communicate when you're storytelling is emotion. You really want to communicate the emotion of a space. You want to communicate the emotion of a character on stage. And actually, one of the really interesting kind of references that I like to kind of go to, that I'm sure that a lot of people have experienced, is actually either at Disneyland or on a ride, where it's narratively telling you a story within 3 minutes. So, for example, this one, Mystic Manor in Disneyland, is the whole story is about this monkey who opens this magical box, and he then releases a whole load of magic that kind of causes a lot of havoc within the space. So you, as the viewer, as the rider, you go through that story, that story, and you're taken on this whole journey. And I think what's really interesting about that is that it really takes you on an emotional journey. Or even if you go, there's also a Disneyland ride of Ratatouille that also takes you on an emotional journey within 3 minutes. So it takes you, you know, on the introduction, and then you create this bond with this character, and you really care for this character, and then all of a sudden all of this manic kind of craziness happens to them. So it really pulls, you know, really pulls on your emotions. And I think one of the amazing things that the way that this Mystic Manor ride does that is that it uses a lot of illusions, and it uses a lot of light in terms of what you see and what you can't see. So kind of things just appear and disappear, and it's really magical, and it really takes you on such a journey within such a short amount of time. And then this is another image where this has really strong kind of, it's like a top high side light again. which is just a shaft of light, and there's a lot of haze that we've used. So this was for a show called Equus, and this was a moment where a character was drawn to this horse, and they had a really strong emotional connection. And the idea of this is that even though within storytelling on stage, an actor also obviously tells a lot of the story in terms of their presence, but there's also their movement, and it's the interaction with the light, it's the interaction with the space, as well as the interaction with the sound. It's the whole environment, and it's the whole package. So in order to create, you know, that emotional, intense bond together, I really condensed down the space just to them two. And I also added a lot of haze into the room, and a lot of haze also picks up all of that light beam, which creates which makes the light a lot more material within the space, because you can make light very immaterial, and well, it is immaterial, but you can make it seem even more immaterial by disappearing and just you know, flooding light within a space. So for example, the sunlight coming straight through into you know, into a forest, for example, it kind of just it drapes over everything. But then for this moment, I kind of wanted to focus in just on them. So that's what that was about, and that was how you heightened the emotion of these two characters on stage. And focus. So again, going back to Disneyland, because I just thought that it's such an interesting, like the way that they kind of plan your journey. They really think about your as audience members going to Disneyland, they really think about the architecture of the space and the journey that you're taken on throughout the space, and the narrative that, you know, the first things that you see, the last things that you see. And so the focus in this photo is obviously you're walking down the street, and the main thing is the castle. Is the castle, you know, draped in lots of LED fairy lights, and is also in this icicle blue that kind of pops out of you. And that's the main focal point of the space. And the way that this space is also designed is that it makes you look, it's a straight street, and there's actually usually quite a few streets that lead to the castle that are usually straight, that make you focus to that, and that's the central point of the park. So it's really interesting how that you know, that architecturally, that focal point is how they kind of bring you in and say, you know, this is the heart of the park. And that's interesting because that's also what you do within theatrical storytelling. You focus people's attention. I know that there's a few lighting designers who say, you know, it's like you're an editor of a movie. You're editing where the audiences are viewing certain moments of action, or certain, you know, if there's a character who's having a monologue, but there's still things going on in the background, for example, like in this image from Fairview, you know, it went into her internal monologue, yet there was still, you know, there was still the action of her family in the background, but they almost went into slow motion. So it was how you then bring that character into the foreground and go, okay, I'm now going to talk to you as an audience member about my internal thoughts and how I feel. So as a lighting designer, you help to focus them. So on Donna at the moment, we have we've got a face light on her from the front, and then around the back, I kind of washed the stage into a purple. So it's almost also like a dream state. So it's indicating not just that we're going to focus on her and her internal monologue, but also the fact that the whole space also turns into her internal space. So it's what she's experiencing on the outside with her family, in the background, but then going into like a purple wash, it's also indicating that we're not in a naturalistic space, we're in quite an abstract space. And that's really, yeah, that's really great to kind of to play with. You need to really play with the focus of where the audience are looking and what they're viewing, if you want them to see the whole stage or if you want them to focus on one little speck. And location. So location is really important within storytelling, so that because you're in one space in a theatre, and there could be set pieces changing, but there also could not be set pieces changing. So as the lighting designer, you're helping to also locate where the action is taking place within that script, within that narrative. And so, for example, this is from The Mirror and the Light, where the set was actually a concrete box, which was taken inspiration by an architect called Tadeo Ando. And essentially it was amazing grey kind of concrete that really took light amazingly. And because of that, I was able to kind of transform that in so many different ways, because that material took light so well. So, you know, you could make it look really, really gaunt and kind of gloomy and really dark and sinister. But then on the flip side, you could then make it feel like a really grand hall where there was a wedding ceremony happening, and there was, you know, it was springtime and there was sunlight flooding through these big windows. So it was a really great space that you could transform in so many different ways, which made it a lot easier to transform it from different locations. So, for example, in this photo, they're in the court. So it's Henry VIII, and they're having a chat, basically. Well, they're having a really deep conversation about how they should proceed in terms of the army and the war that's happening. So it's really interesting how you can kind of transform, and you can really locate where the action is happening within the script, and you really need to help the audience in guiding them. But then there's also a leeway into where do you also let go and go, actually, as audience members, we're letting you use your imagination. So there's a real relationship that you also need to have with the audience, in terms of where you give them as much as they need, and then they also run with the rest of it. Of, you know, you let their imagination run wild of, you know, where it is and where it could be. And another really specific one was from a show called Dick Whittington, which was a panto, which is also very specific in terms of the locations, and you had to be really clear about it, because also the audience for a panto, for this particular panto, was for a lot younger audience. So from you know, young children up to like 16, 17 years old. So you had to be very specific about location. But this was also done in the round, where audience members are all around the stage, which made it a lot harder in terms of scenery. So we had a lot to do in terms of lighting. So for this particular image, you can see Queen Rat, who's stolen all of the money from the cafe, is backlit in quite a sinister way. So that's storytelling that she's obviously the bad guy. But then also behind her, you can see these are all, we weren't actually allowed to use real lasers. Nor did we have the budget for it. So we actually used these moving lights called Sharpies, and also some GLP X4 bars. And we kind of we created the atmosphere of, and also with the sound design that Paul did, you know, we really integrated the idea of like these lasers kind of integrating into the space and cutting through the space. So we linked the sound and the lighting together in order to help to tell that story to the audience. We were also very, you know, this was a really great way of, because it started off as she was in the cafe and she was tiptoeing around at nighttime, trying to steal the money from the safe. And then it all of a sudden kind of bursts into this Mission Impossible moment. So we had to really set the scene as very naturalistic and almost, you know, make the audience feel a full sense of security, like, oh yeah, it's just a cafe, it's just at nighttime, you know, we're very familiar with this space. And then all of a sudden make it a very dangerous space, make the location you know, feel very different to what it was before, to create tension within the space and to, you know, to create a climax. The rhythm and pace, which is kind of similar to what I was just touching upon in terms of having the cafe from Dick Whittington then turn into a very dangerous space that was really full of lots of action. So we had all the, you know, them Sharpie moving lights kind of coming on really fast, in really fast succession. So that made the rhythm and the pace of the storytelling then heighten. And another example of this is a show called 7 Methods of Killing Kylie Jenner, where As you can see in this, picture on the left-hand side, it's a very naturalistic tungsten space where the story was essentially of two girls who, one of them sets up a Twitter account and starts posting anonymously about 7 ways of killing Kylie Jenner and her appropriation of Black women. And it was really interesting because we had to switch from a very naturalistic bedroom into Twitter and the internet. So it's like, how do you story tell that on stage? Because it's very naturalistic, and then it's so abstract to then be like, we're on the internet, we're being Twitter. So Raja, the set designer, came up with this amazing idea of this tree, and me and her had a lot of conversations about what that material is, and how that can take light. Because then there was an idea of, well, in a very naturalistic bedroom, you would have a lot of tungsten light, you would have a lot of warmth in it, it would feel quite safe, very familiar to everyone. And then we were saying that the internet and Twitter, the storytelling of that is that it can feel very unpredictable, it feels very aggressive, it feels very there's 110 things happening all at once on Twitter, and everything's trying to grab your attention. So we went from somewhere which felt like a safe space, and it only had one lighting state throughout the whole of that, them scenes where they were in the bedroom. But then when we jumped onto Twitter, it completely changed, and there was a cue nearly every 10 seconds, 20 seconds. It was really intense. And the intensity of that was in order to show the real switch in the space, the switch in the location, and also the rhythm and the pace. Then, that helped to drive the story, and that helped to create a real tension within the space and within the story. So that's how you can, with light, that's how you can help to drive the story, as well as the action on stage, as well as the sound that's happening. It's all together as a collaboration. You can really push that story and push that pace and rhythm. And then on the other side of that, of pushing pace and rhythm, in terms of like architectural lighting, it's quite interesting. I mean, obviously it's not as extreme, but in terms of your experience as an audience member, as an audience member walking through a gallery, the way that they light certain aspects of a gallery, really that focuses your attention. It also has to practically hit the paintings or the sculpture in a way that doesn't change the way that it's meant to be viewed. So for example, the colors on a painting, whatever light that you have on that, it shouldn't change the color of that. Also in terms of the then there's also the technical part of like, there's only so much light that certain objects within a gallery can take. So you have to really, you have to think very precisely about what that is. But in terms of the rhythm and pace of a room, it's also directing you and your focus, where you're walking, what direction you're walking, where you're looking, where's your focus within that room. And they also do that, for example, on the tube, which is quite interesting. If you walk down the tunnel on the tube, a lot of the time the lights will be vertical and traveling in the direction that you're traveling in. And that's also to help the pace of the space. So it's to help you move in that direction, which is really interesting. So it's, it's influencing the way that you move within a space, which is similar to what a gallery does. And another example of that is the entrance to a gallery. Well, this is, for example, in the V&A, where you have that central hub when you walk in, and you have loads of different entrances and exits that you could go through. So it's so in that sense, then the lighting and the story of that space changes in the fact that it becomes way more open, and it's saying, you could go in loads of different directions and you're free to move around the space. Whereas before, when you're in a gallery space, it can feel a little more contained and a little more like you're on this journey throughout the space. So I guess similar in a way to a Disneyland ride like Mystic Manor. And another kind of relationship to a journey within a space is also like a supermarket. So supermarket lighting, that also has to be so specific in terms of you know, how there's certain ways that you can do it, so it creates a whole journey for a customer to go through, you know, kind of what, you know, it helps what produce is kind of there, but also kind of what lighting, what direction of lighting, what's the temperature of the lights also, because that can also help to make the fruit and vegetables and the food in general just a lot more vibrant within a space. So it can make customers also more willing to buy, because it looks a lot more healthy and it looks a lot more ripened. So it's it's very interesting how there is a correlation of kind of storytelling, but then also practicality also within these spaces. And I also would say that there's also a practicality within storytelling in theatre. So, for example, you know, you need, as a lighting designer, you need to be able to create that atmosphere, create that mood. You know, with the color that you use, with the texture that you use, with the intensities of the different types of fixtures that you decide to use within a space. But then there's also the flip side of also making sure that you know, the actors or the dancers, the performers on stage are also well lit, so the audience can engage with them and engage with what they're saying, with their actions, with the text within the space. So there's a real balance that you need to also create in terms of the artistic storytelling to also the practicalities of, so who at what point needs to be storytelling within within a story. So for example, there might be a moment where actually the text is the most important out of all of the creative elements to tell that part of the story. So it's almost like all the other creative elements kind of back away a bit and let that kind of take center stage. So it's kind of like a to and fro with you know, kind of what departments, and you kind of get that language by having conversations and having collaborations with all the other departments, which is really important that you do that, because you need to be able to kind of understand the relationship that they also have with that text, the relationship they also have with that story. How do they communicate that story? You know, similar to Disneyland and to that space, you know, how do they all collaborate together, all the different departments, to create a world that's all engulfing. And that's very, very similar to also kind of what we do within theatre and within that storytelling. And you know, another way of you know, when you collaborate, you then lead on to talking a lot of the set designer, for example, and the light and the materials are really important. So the relationship with light and material, which in this image, for example, in Dear Elizabeth, the set designer, Moy, who this whole story is about two characters who, well, actually it's a true story about two poets who wrote letters to each other for many years and were almost like long lost lovers, but never, you know, life always got in the way and they never ended up together, but they always wrote these really beautiful letters to each other. And there was always a through line within that narrative of water. And there was a few, like, you know, they always referred to water within a lot of their stories and a lot of their poems. So Moy, the set designer, was like, oh, I really want to create that within the space. So we started having conversations about how can you transform a space to make it feel like there's water in the space, to make it feel like there's that element of it in the room, but not actually have water within the space. So then we experimented with different materials and how they reflect with light, you know, different materials that reflect with light. And we found this material, which was brilliant. And also when you lit it, it made the legs of the table look like, you know, they were just falling into water. And also it was like a never ending kind of pool. It was really beautiful. It was a really beautiful way of kind of correlating that story between these two characters within the space. And so yeah, that's kind of the end of a very the end of the storytelling talk, I guess, which is a very short snippet of how you do it, but yeah, and this is the credits to all the shows that I have also shown on the previous slides.
Thank you so much for that. Sorry, it takes a while for me to click the buttons on. It kind of makes you feel like that you're talking to nobody. No, we were all very transfixed by what you had to say, and there's definitely a lot of sensitivity in your work. It comes across to me very much so that you're really listening to what the directors are trying to do, and the writers of the play or screen directors or so on, to try and get that whole kind of storytelling together, particularly when there's a lot to tell. So I think children's theatre is very underestimated. Children aren't stupid, and they're bombarded with a lot of images and stuff. So to try and convince them that one place was a safe place and then it's a scary place just by using light is a massive triumph. So yeah, I can congratulate you on that. I'm just looking down on the chat box, and it looks like it says that I've got two questions to ask you, but I can't. Yeah. Oh, Tad is saying he's got a question. So he's asking if he can ask a question. Please, can you type what the question is, Tad, and then I'll be able to ask it. But
am I supposed to type it in, or can I just ask it?
No, that's even better. Thank you. Thank you, Gula.
Hi, Jessica. Thank you for that. Some really beautiful images there. I've got a slightly geeky and self-indulgent question for you. Sorry, I didn't catch which show it was. The show that had the vertical and the horizontal LED.
Oh yeah, the
bars,
tubes,
stripes, the tubes, whatever you want to call them. I had a similar kind of effect on a show once, and we spotted an effect that none of us was expecting. I wondered just if you had the same thing too. When we dimmed these vertical LED strips, we found that audience members just looking around the room would, all it took was a small movement of the head, and because they were dimmed and flickering, suddenly you'd get these like after images of lots of these vertical lines of LED appearing in the sky. I'm wondering if that's something you've had too, or did we just have really bad dimmers?
No, we had kind of the same. We had this idea of using the effect actually, because I mean the show Blindness is, we essentially plunged the whole audience into darkness, and they had these headphones on which used binaural sound. So that means that the way that they recorded it was from this like head that had lots of different microphones within it that recorded. But you basically when it recorded it, it managed to get your spatial where you were within the space. So when audience listened to it through the headphones, they could hear Juliet from like 10 meters away walking towards them, and it sounded like she then was whispering in your ear. And then they also had that in complete darkness, so that their perception of the space was completely gone, which was really fascinating. And then I guess what we then did is that we then flashed the LED, because the LED tubes came to eye line, so then we flashed them up in their eyes, and then we took it away, and that also left a photographic resonance within their eyes, which was also really fun to play with. Some audience members did not enjoy that, but it was fun and it really worked with the story.
That seems quite like a sensory overload to play with your hearing senses and then the eyes at the same time and in a dark space. Those are the kind of things. I get a bit wobbly when I stand up because I've been disorientated a little bit. I know that you referenced back to haberdashery, and I think I've seen something that Ben did there before, where it was a kind of like advertising panel where that didn't exist. It was lights, and each time the light pulsed, it was giving out a certain reading, and your eye memory was recording that. So it actually made up an image like a billboard type size image at the end. It was quite incredible, this kind of memory that the eye has, and if you did it in a certain frequency or certain way, it built up like a whole picture. I haven't described that very well, but that's kind of the same similar kind of idea that you two are discussing.
That's really, it's almost like that. I don't know if you guys ever did this at school, but there was that image where it's like, if you looked at it for 30 seconds and then you looked at a wall, it's like,
yes, it kind of makes an imprint on your eyes somehow. Yeah, definitely. But I'm sure most of us lighting designers have also looked at lights for too long and then looked away, and you've got that dreaded dot in your eye, in your vision, that you see kind of burnt in there for a little bit that you can't get
matter
rid
how many
of.
times you do it, you will always continually
Yeah.
do.
And I don't know how many. I probably don't have any fingerprints left either, from the amount of times I know I know a lamp's hot and I still touch it with my fingers. So that's also something that's happened. Jessica, I'm going to draw this evening to a close because it keeps our sessions nice and tight for when we put them online. And I'd very much like to invite you to talk for us again, if that's at all possible. Hopefully in real life, with real life audience, that would be amazing. So thank you very much for that for this evening. Thanks again to everybody that's participated tonight. And like I said, we'll put this up on the YouTube channel. And again, special thanks to ETC and 3LR for their continued support. Thanks, Jess, and we'll see you soon. Thank you very much indeed.
Take care.